the beginning of week 3. After everything look good sound-wise too? Yep. Okay, just checking. Welcome from the home viewing audience as well. We'll be getting into Hosea and finishing up Amos tonight. So that's where we are in the class schedule. We'll get to that in a moment, but the week 3 folder already has the PowerPoint slides. If you'd like to open that up and take digital notes, they're there for you. Stuff that we'll be covering tonight. Also, the yeah. Thought I'd add to the distortion, you know. That's okay. I don't. And aren't you into audio? You're an audio guy, aren't you? Surprises me. All right, just kidding.
New box.
This is what we have to have this changed. What's going on here? What do we do? How to do that?
Okay.
That happens at the beginning of every class period.
Your remote is working on the same. Make it stop. That is bizarre.
Okay. Here we go. We back now? Okay. Sorry about that. So where was I? That was kind of adventurous. Okay, where we are in class. So, yeah. So there we go. Is it on? Yours? Okay. Screen-wise? Okay. So after today, after the lecture gets posted, Patrick's going to work on that. He'll have the Adobe Connect direct links if you're Speedy Gonzalez. But if you're not, you want to wait for the YouTube links. Those will be up probably tomorrow, maybe? Afternoon or evening, something like that.
I would say evening.
Yeah, so those will be ready for everybody. And then the group discussion question, which will come out of tonight's discussion, will be posted as well. So that's where we are in the class. I'd like to begin in prayer and keep praying for our fellow brothers and sisters in Houston. I've got a collection of names here of, I'm surprised, the 2 classes I'm teaching, I've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 13 students who are either currently impacted in the Houston area with the flood direct or are very intensely involved in the cleanup and rescue efforts over this last week. So we'll just pray through them by name. I want to mention them all by name just because they've been letting me know and keeping me updated. But the nice thing about this class, its flexibility is going to allow them to get caught up in the weeks ahead and kind of stay current as best they can, whether your electricity's on or off, which is really great, or the internet's spotty at best. It's really been encouraging. I'll share one story with you from one of our students named Marilyn. She emailed me one of the stories of her churches, which is one of the distribution hubs for distribution of goods, as well as kind of a rallying place for people who come down who want to volunteer to clean up, which is already, as you know, already started. So this is them in disguise. That's their son, and that's Marilyn and her husband in mask cleaning up a house there. This just shows you how much rallying has been going on. People who come in, they all had an organizational meeting in her church, and they break out into teams when they get together, and they pray and go out for the day. These are some of the things that are going on just at her church alone. So you got cleanup, you got collection, there's some, ripping up stuff out of the houses and the neighborhoods and all of this going on, and lots of bright, smiley faces. We love you, HOU. I think that's one of the rally shirts, but they're giving away, supplies and food, necessity items for the home and all of those things from their church alone. But here's where we put feet to it, right? When we do these things, when the church rallies like this, people take note. She shares the story. One of the things that's so awesome is that our teams have been going out into the community and working in homes that were flooded. The response from a non-believing community has been great. 2 examples that I've personally been involved with, one with a Muslim family and one with a gay couple in the community in the neighborhood. A group from my church was working on a house, but there were too many of us in the house, so I started walking around to all the neighborhoods to compile a list of their needs. I walked across the street to a house that had been flooded with about 3 feet of water. The couple's name was Rick and Rudy. They were brand new to the area, and she talked to them for a while. She prayed with them, and then she went on to their neighbor's house. About 30 minutes later, she noticed that they'd returned back to their house with some supplies to start cleaning. So then she gathered about 15 folks from her church group and headed to their house and just jumped in, pulling up flooring and hauling it out to the street. By the time it got dark, we had pulled up all of their flooring and removed about half of their sheetrock. As I was gathering my kids to head home for the day, Rick and Rudy took me aside and thanked me and asked me, "Why did you do this for us?" And she told them, "We serve because Jesus was our example and he came to serve." We have a saying at our church, she says, quote, "We don't serve to convert, we serve because we've been converted." I got to spend some time telling them that we have been changed through Christ and we can't help but serve. That's what she said. They were even more astonished when they heard we were all doing this out of a flooded church themselves. So the Muslim family had a very similar response and just kept asking why. Why were we helping them when we don't even believe what they do? They said if more Christians acted that way, then more people would want to be Christians. They'd let us pray with them and agreed to letting us follow up with them in the coming weeks. So what happens when we put feet? And I know other students are part of the relief efforts as the teams have been going down to Houston. So let's just make that a matter of prayer. Let's do it like we did last week. Just team up with your prayer buddy, pray for just a few minutes, and I'll chime in and wrap us up in our prayer time. So let's break and pray as the Lord puts things on your heart. Maybe you know some people by name. You can pray for them by name, and then I'll come back after just a minute or two. All right? If you don't know that person, introduce yourself, and let's get started. Let's pray together. Lord, we just declare that you are truly amazing. Lord, your name, your reputation has been going out amongst the Christians in the churches that have been rallying to serve you, not because they're seeking converts, but because they have truly been converted, as Marilyn shared. And Lord, as an overflow of their love for people, which is the love that you have for people. And Lord, these people, we just pray for these churches who are serving as centers for distribution and for relief and for cleanup efforts and rallying points for volunteers and students like Marilyn and others who are helping to organize and taking time out of their day to do all of these things. Pray for strength, for relief. We pray for health, for the volunteers who are burning the midnight oil. And to the names that we've lifted up, I pray specifically for Sean, for Benjamin, for Charles, Russell, Warren, Steve, Jonathan, Jake, Rob, Jason, Kenny, and Roland. Some who are also part of the relief efforts, but some others who are part of the victims of the flood and the flooding, who have lost homes, who have to replace their lifestyle and are seeking the what next, the way forward. They're trusting you, Lord, and they're also trying to maintain their family and rebuild and recuperate. Lord, just pray that you'd provide miraculously for each one, each that we've mentioned by name and others as well. Thank you, Lord, for a place like Southwestern to be a student in a very flexible atmosphere. We can have a variety of ways to access our class and join together and learn. Pray that you'd guide us tonight through your Spirit, keep us alert and awake, guide our conversation, and direct our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thank you for that. All right. Well, we started Amos. There's his picture. We'll talk about the plumb line passage in a little bit. I have a different spin on that, by the way, so I'll have to keep you in suspense. We learned Amos is from the south. He's going up to Israel in the north, so don't be frustrated by my reorganization of the prophets that we'll be covering. What I'll be doing is trying to treat the prophets as best we can chronologically. So the first group of prophets, Amos, Hosea, Jonah, and Isaiah, I kind of treat those as prophets who are called to reach out to the north, Israel. So the northern prophets, so we call them the pre-exilic prophets. Then we'll have a whole group or a bucket full of prophets who are active right on top of the fall of Israel in the north, fall of Samaria, and then eventual collapse of Jerusalem in the south. And then we'll have a small group of prophets at the end we call post-exilic prophets that'll reach out and encourage that group that's come out of the 70 years of Babylonian exile under the Persian rule. So Amos is getting us started, and we talked about the prophetic vantage point that was important. The prophets are, of course, called by God. We talked about that earlier, but also they're getting a message from the Lord. They have to speak. That bubbling forth idea that we talked about, shaking up that Diet Coke bottle and you're going to explode unless you release what's inside, the pressure that's inside. That's the sense of urgency that the prophets had. But they're also sharing that divine vantage point. We talked about the kind of that eternal reality, God above time. He's giving the prophets glimpses into that eternal reality of what's, and it gives them the ability, I'll argue, and I argued last week, to predict, right? To predict the future and to warn God's people based on coming events. So that's what we'll start to see with the prophets. The injustice theme is really primary with the prophet Amos. That's one of his big attacking points, you might say. He's calling them on the carpet with regards to the injustice. Israel at the time was at the heyday, one of the heydays. There was a time of relative prosperity, political rest. There weren't any major wars going on, and all of Israel was pretty much pictured here to the right. And we'll see right away here that there's injustice. They're being accused of injustice. And this one of the prophetic roles that we'll see in Amos and also in Hosea is this role of the prophetic lawsuit that the prophets will build against the guilty, in this case Israel in the north. They're going to build their prophetic lawsuit or their case against Israel based on, I would argue, as we did last week, material that's already in place. They should have known better. Why? It's because they have access to the Bible written up until that point. The Pentateuch, all of Moses' instruction, all of the laws about how to govern and how to build a covenant community. When those laws are broken by God's people, then there's a lawsuit that's to be had. So that's what we talked about. And it fits that, it tracks well with the covenant idea and how covenant is structured. So there's a lot of parallels there that we'll see in the prophetic message. So we argued, the Pentateuch, for example, has to come before, and it's prior to the active prophets like Amos, like Hosea. They're pulling their evidence A, evidence B, evidence C from Moses' teaching and instruction from the Pentateuch. So he builds, and we talked about, it's interesting, the strategy that Amos starts with. In the very first chapter, he starts to address injustice in the world. And the neighboring people groups and territories in and around Israel, and they're in the dark green, all of the cases that Amos is going to make against the neighboring, Israel's neighbors. And we looked at one particular example last week with regards to Syria, Damascus, and that's the idea of the war crime, perhaps, whether the soldiers of the victorious soldiers actually went out on the battlefield and ripped to shreds the dying or the dead on the battlefield, or if it's just kind of used metaphorically. I think it probably actually happened. That's why it's become front and foremost in Amos's list. These were implements used for threshing grain, like pictured here. But then finally, when we'll pick up here, let's turn to chapter 2. Amos chapter 2, starting in verses 4 through 5. Now it gets a little more personal. Amos has charged all of the neighboring countries and territories. Now it's time to kind of get a little closer to home. His gaze now turns just south of the border to Judah, Israel's half-brother. Judah is listed in this long list of Israel's neighbors, and we've already seen very intense crimes of injustice, crimes against humanity. And Israel, I'm sure, in the First Baptist Church of Samaria, stood up and cheered. Yep, Judah deserves what's coming to him. Yeah, we all know what they've been doing lately. We've been all very, very busy in Israel. We've been very active religiously. We have some very fine churches in our northern, nation, and our king's very involved in helping lead the charge spiritually. We're very active and very proud of it. God is obligated to bless us, but not Judah in the south. What's their crime? So let's take a look at chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. Let's see. Could I have Damien? Could you read that? Chapter 2, verses 4 through 5. I'll call on some people to read, so not that you're not ready, but just give an advanced warning. Kind of
1 through 5,
chapter 2, verses 4 through 5.
4 through 5.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, the Lord says, I will not relent from punishing Judah for 3 crimes, even 4. Because they have rejected the instruction of the Lord and have not kept the statutes, the laws that their ancestors followed have led them astray. Therefore, I will send fire against Judah, and it will consume the citadels of Jerusalem.
Okay. Well, what would have been the response of kind of prideful and spiritually smug Israel? Yeah, Judah's got what's coming to him, right? Something like that. And you can see here in the charge against Judah, Amos is focusing on the fact that they have rejected the law. The word behind that word law, remember, I get to use my double thick pen, is the idea of the Torah. And I'll keep, coming back to this. It's the idea of, it's the noun form of the word that means to teach or instruct. So when you see the Torah, or often translated in English, law, really the idea, the operation behind that is the idea, this is coming from Moses' instruction. And if you had me for OT1, I make a big deal about Moses' instruction is all about what's contained in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Moses is preparing Israel for what? Life in the promised land. To do what? To be a new nation. Did they have to be instructed? Absolutely. They learned a few things in the wilderness, but they needed to have some details given to them. How to eat different than the pagans, how to worship different than the pagans, how to raise a family different than the pagans, how to mirror and carry and represent the name, the fullness of the name of Yahweh, everything that Yahweh meant. That is his reputation. Don't take that name in vain. One of the 10 Commandments, right? But what Judah has done, according to the charge of Amos, she as a nation has rejected the Torah. So the marriage certificate, which is kind of like the idea behind a covenant relationship, but it's the marriage idea. Two parties coming together and issuing their consent. I do. One member of the marriage has just walked out. Talk to the hand because the face ain't listening. So this is the charge. This is walking away. A nation has walked away from her covenant relationship and thus her obligations. So the rejection of Torah. All right, so any questions on that? So it's interesting. We'll get into Hosea tonight. And as you probably know, Hosea marries Gomer, who together as a couple become the walking billboard of what this is all about, walking out on a marriage, which actually I argue happens in the book of Hosea, but we'll talk about that later tonight. But what Judah has done by rejecting the Torah, she's gone to find other lovers. The idea of adultery becomes connotated with idolatry, right? Finding other false gods, little g gods to worship. And we've talked about this. This is this whole walking after. You see that? The idea of walking after. Where is it here? Walked after. There at the end of verse 4. Walking after is the idea, the Old Testament idea of saying, leaving home, walking out of the relationship. Deuteronomy 8:19, Jeremiah 11:10, Ezekiel 20:16. Pursuing false gods, walking after other gods is the idea. Judah is living as if she's not married, not in covenant relationship, and as subsequently is living as if she's forgotten the Lord, which Moses, by the way, warns against in Deuteronomy chapter 8. So this is where it all comes from, and it's easy to see how Amos is building his covenant case against Judah from the very words and instructions of Moses. He's not writing it as he goes. So that's one of the fallacies of that critical argument that we talked about last week. Did the Torah come first and then the prophetic activity? Or did the prophetic activity somehow generate this monotheism, this rigid adherence to monotheism? So I obviously argue that Moses is well in place, well entrenched, and the prophets just come along and say, look, you should know better. You've already had this teaching. You've been in church growing up. You went to Sunday school, so you should know better. Finally, in an interesting twist. Now we go to Amos chapter 2, verses 6. And let's just read that first verse. Let's see. Michael, here, could you read for us?
Thus says the Lord, the three transgressions of Israel and for forth I will revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver, and they need for pairs of sandals.
Okay, you can hear the hush in the crowd. The audience in First Baptist Church of Samaria is aghast that the prophet has now turned to them. He's building his covenant lawsuit against them. This guy, we invited him in as a friend, and now he's becoming enemy number one. So let's see what he does with Israel. He's going to take a stand here and bring a charge against Israel. In the first part there in verse 6, because they sell the righteous for money and the needy for a pair of sandals. Let's take a look at where this covenant case comes from. Let's turn to Exodus, some of the teaching of Moses, by the way. Exodus chapter 23. Exodus chapter 23, and Trevor, could you read for us in chapter 23, verses 6 through 8?
You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in right. You shall not oppress sojourners. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt.
Okay. You see there's a concern, a divine concern, for all kinds of the down and outs. We're not to pervert justice to take advantage of the poor and the needy in a covenant community. That's a no-no. And not only that, but the strangers and the aliens from other lands who come in, you're not to pervert justice to take advantage of them either. In other words, Israel should be a showcase for fairness, for justice, for fair due trials. Did I say that right? Fair due? No. Trials that are managed and held responsibly. If we turn over just a few chapters to Deuteronomy 16, let's turn there together. This is another parallel passage in Deuteronomy 16, verses 18 through 20. Let's see, Tad, could you read?
Appoint judges and officials for yourselves from each of your tribes in all the towns the Lord your God has given you. They must judge the people fairly. You must never twist justice or show partiality. Never accept a bribe, for bribes blind the eyes of the wise and corrupt the decisions of the godly. Let true justice prevail, so you may live and occupy the land the Lord your God has given you.
It's good, yeah. There to be a showcase for justice. The watching nations who are around would have been talking about this. The idea was that they take notice of the fairness, the justice that's in Israel, unlike themselves. And there's a contrast made. They do this evangelistically. They're putting feet to their faith in this picture. So this idea of selling here in verse 6b, selling could mean, you're in the midst of a judicial proceeding, and it would mean the selling idea. That means the bribery of justice. So justice is perverted, the idea of selling the righteous for money, and the needy for a pair of sandals. So as we saw, this was condemned by covenant law or Moses' teaching, or it could also potentially mean the selling of innocent people into slavery for the debts that they may have owed. So in this case, the righteous, in this idea, righteous means not sin-free, but debt-free. So, or legal-free, right? Something like that. So the crime is selling someone into slavery so the person can pay back a legal debt, but who is by law legally free. So that's taking advantage of here the situation. So, let's look at another passage, and there's a lot of teaching on this in the Pentateuch. Let's look at Leviticus chapter 25. Leviticus chapter 25, verses beginning in verse 39. Here we go. Let's see here. Let's see, Boyd, could you read for us, beginning in verse 39 down through 40, and then verse 42?
Chapter 25, verse 39.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
One of your countrymen becomes poor, you shall sell himself to you. Do not make him work as a slave. He is to be treated as a hired worker or a temporary resident among you. He will work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then he and his children are to be released, and he will go back to his own clan and the property of his forefathers. Go on to 42.
Got 42.
Yes, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves.
Yeah, what's interesting, there was a redemptive aspect. This is really, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but the idea of the redemptive aspect of how Israel was to help the poor. In other words, if I'm poor, and if I owe money, I'm given an opportunity to work back towards the debt that I owe, but up through and no, not beyond that 7-year period, the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee, every 7 years, those debts would be wiped away, and then the hired man could choose to stay on for the means of employment. In other words, his debt is relinquished. What he owes is wiped clean, but he could choose to stay on to be a hired hand, to continue to be a servant in the household structure. Every household was like a mini business, so they needed hired hands to work in the fields, to produce whatever the household is producing to be sold in the city markets and things like that. So this was part of the economic design for a revolutionary new nation called Israel. This was for everybody's benefit. Everybody was to benefit, and the Lord, this would be a conduit of the Lord to bless all of his people. And unfortunately, this gets short-circuited because of Israel's propensity towards injustice and taking advantage of. And this is what's going on. So they're short-circuiting themselves.
I have a question.
Yes, sir. I hope I have an answer.
Yeah, well, it's just more of a application, in college, back 6-7 years ago, I used to gamble, for like pokers with my friends, money. Would that be in a sense selling righteousness for silver? When you talk about churches don't like gambling and stuff like that, does that have any relation to like?
It's not in this. Well, there's other passages I might go grab to build an argument against gambling, but this is more of a direct application in terms of intentionally taking advantage of those who might be poor, who owe a debt. So leveraging that against them, keeping them down forever and ever because of some kind of system that's been created. Yeah, we can evaluate government policies this way, yeah. Perhaps that aren't helpful. Sometimes this way, yeah.
Is this one of the passages that the framers used to come up with U.S. bankruptcy laws?
Oh, I have to look at that one. That's be a great extra credit project for you to investigate. I don't know if I can speak intelligently to that. Finance is not I'm an engineer, mechanical engineer, so that means I don't know how to add and subtract. So, all right, let's keep going here. So just as a way of summary, this idea of Israel being a showcase or an example, because all of this stems from the nature and character of who God is, right? God's concern is for the poor, for the needy, for righteousness that permeates a covenant community. So social justice, compassion for the poor, religious vitality, but instead it seems as if Israel has moved into this camp of being an example of social injustice, mistreatment of the poor, and even religious abuse. And here's where we get into that. Of course, there's more to this charge that Amos here is bringing against Israel. Let's go back to the text in Amos chapter 2. So we've just kind of gotten into it, and all of a sudden Amos turns up and amplifies the picture here. Let's take a look beginning in verse 7. So who are these needy? Who are these poor? These who pant after the very dust of the earth, verse 7, on the head of the helpless, and turn aside the way of the humble. And a man and his father resort to the same girl, in order to profane my holy name and reputation. I added the word reputation. And on garments taken as pledges, they stretch out beside every altar, and in the house of their God, they drink the wine of those who have been fined. Let's unpack that. I don't know if you've ever taken a long gander or a look into this passage. It gets pretty intense here. Amos is painting a picture, and here's the idea. We already know that there's probably young girls in and within the Israelite community who may be in that class of pagan prostitute because of the syncretism. And we'll talk about Baal, the fertility god that was part of the worship experience of Israel in the north. Baal was the fertility god, so you can only fill in the blank. Churches who are worshiping Baal, we know that they had male and female prostitutes as part of the community outreach efforts. So there you go. Sexual promiscuity, which involves here, in this case, both father and son, is a crime against the poor and the oppressed. So we have to fill in the gaps a little bit here to suggest perhaps that this girl in this account, her situation represents just one example of being poor. Perhaps here a pagan prostitute, she's already a victim of the system perhaps. She's being forced to pay back her debts, possibly her debts or the debts of her household, to paying them back with sex. And here's why I make this case. Garments taken as pledges. Let's turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 24. And Moses had, interestingly, he had taught on this. A lot of these details that we see in the Pentateuch are intentionally specific because they instruct the opposite of what the pagan world was doing in that day that Moses was aware of, being a well-educated, growing up in Egypt. In chapter 24, verses 10 through 13, Derek, would you read that for us? Chapter 24 in Deuteronomy, verses 10 through, 14. 10 through 13.
Oh, okay. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And he shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God.
Here you have the reference to the pledge, something that was taken as a pledge. So if somebody owes me money, I can, demand my money, immediate payback, or I can say I'll take something as a token or a pledge, as a promissory note of some kind, so that I know that you'll pay me back. When you pay me back, I'll give this back to you, right? That's the idea of a pledge. And then we have in verse 13, don't take a cloak as a pledge. So what you have to do is understand that a cloak referred to here is the most important and valuable piece of clothing that one would own. The cloak was like your sleeping bag at night. If you were traveling, this was the heavy outer garment. So it would keep you warm. During the day, it'd keep you cool, it would protect you, but at night it would keep you warm because it becomes your sleeping bag. It was the most important article of clothing that you would own. So the reference to garments taken as pledges here refers to the idea of the cloak. A poor person's coat, probably the most expensive item of clothing they own. If you take that as a pawn, you have to return it before night according to the law. Because over here in verse 17, you shall not pervert the justice due an alien or an orphan, nor take a widow's garment in pledge. Do you see that in verse 17? And that's because to take a cloak, to take that outer garment as a pledge, is a form of manipulating and basically taking full advantage of that poor person who owes money.
Would it also be putting in danger to their life?
Yeah, you're putting somebody's life in danger. You take away their cloak as a pledge, you're in the position of power and you're manipulating them. So guess what happens next with this father-son duo? What they say to this girl is, look, we'll let you go home with your cloak, but we want something else before you go home, see? They've just leveraged the situation. So, and that's what we have here. Garments stretched out beside every altar. The implication here, and turn back to Exodus chapter 22. We'll see some more of what Moses teaches. It's very emphatic in the Pentateuch. Exodus 22, beginning in verse 26. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you are to return it to him or her before the sun sets. For that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall come about that when he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. So it's interesting. That's what I just kind of described to you. So the implication here back in Amos, let's go back to Amos now. Lost my place here. Amos chapter 2. And the details there, you got to fill in a little bit. And a man and a father resort to the same girl in order to profane my holy name. And on garments or cloaks taken as pledges, they stretch out beside every altar. So this is in direct violation to what Moses has taught, and they're totally leveraging the situation in their favor. They're taking full advantage of this poor, innocent girl to their financial gain. And not only that, they seem to be doing it right in the midst of the holy centers, or in the house of the Lord. So this is the full impact now of that fancy term that I introduced last week called syncretism. Syncretism, if you remember, is Yahweh plus other gods. So they'll talk about Yahweh, but they're really more about worshiping these other gods. Namely, and we'll look at the god Baal or Baal here in a little bit, one of the central gods of the Canaanite pantheon or collection of gods. All right, so this is a pretty emphatic. This is what the prophets do to get the attention of the people. They have full intent of speaking intensely at times because they want to get the attention of the people, because they're speaking for the Lord, right? They're like that bottle of Coke shaken up to its full capacity, and they are going to explode unless they get this out. And it's what the people need to hear. Sometimes we have to be, we have to implement tough love. And that's what we're going to see here and talk about. So then in chapter 3 in the book of Amos, the prophet is going to develop and build 3 different, we call these lawsuits, the covenant lawsuits against Israel. And after a brief historical review in chapter 3, we start to see these. And each one, chapters 3, 4, and 5, each begin with the word or the phrase, hear this word. And you see it in chapter 3, verse 1, chapter 4, verse 1, and chapter 5, verse 1. Hear this word. So that's kind of a way of organizing the message that Amos has. 3 lawsuits against Israel. Now what's significant about that, again, this is why we go back to the Pentateuch. I think the prophets Hosea and Amos are very, very in touch with Moses' teaching. They're fully aware of the good old book of their day. And you see this because here's where they're pulling from. You probably know it, but let's turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Probably the most famous Old Testament passage of all time. The famous Shema. right? This is the Shema passage. So Amos is starting each of these covenant lawsuits with hear. That's the word Shema. That's the command voice in Hebrew. Shema. It means to hear. But the word Shema in Hebrew also means obey. It means both hear and obey. So there's no disconnect between hearing and obeying with the one Hebrew word. And you see in chapter 6, verse 4, Moses is preaching here and he says, "Hear, O Israel," the famous passage, "the Lord," capital L-O-R-D, "Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone," or Yahweh is one. "And you shall love Yahweh with your God with all your heart." The singularity of one God means one heart, one allegiance, one heart of allegiance. "And with all your soul, with all your might." And these words, that's the connection to the passage in Amos, "Hear these words, which I am commanding you today, shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your sons and your daughters. Take them wherever you go, wherever you sit in your house, wherever you walk outside along your way, and when you lie down, when you rise up, and every nook and cranny of life." You're supposed to have these words ready to go because you're hearing and you're obeying. Because why? You worship the one true God of the universe, the one who's created, who sits and rules as king. None of that's done. None of that's over. If that's changed, you're the one that's moved, not the Lord. I'm just kind of preaching now. But all right. So this is obviously an echo. This is a strong theological echo from what Moses has emphasized already. They would hear this and they'd say, "Oh, our ears just perked up." I remember learning that verse as a kid growing up in Sunday school. So the first covenant lawsuit, we'll take our first break here in just a few minutes. Let's go back to Amos chapter 3. And I'll just read verses 1 and 2. Actually, I went to Seth. Where are you? There you are. Could you read verses 1 and 2 in Amos chapter 3?
Hear this word that the Lord has spoken against you, O people of Israel, against the whole family that I brought up out of the land of Egypt.
You're probably reading it way too nicely. Amos would not have been so nice. He's preaching. I don't embarrass you. I'm just...
Where am I going to? I forget now.
I'll tell you to stop.
You only have I known all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities.
Whoa, we'll just stop right there. So that idea of known, the idea is chosen there in verse 2. You only have I chosen. I prefer that translation. Out of all of the families of the earth. So what we have here, this is a family affair. Because if you know the history of Israel in terms of their early relationship with the Lord, they are told early on how unique they are as a nation, right? They're amongst all of the nations. They're the smallest. They're not the wealthiest. They're not the biggest, the brightest, the best. They didn't score the highest scores on their SAT scores. They're just, but the Lord chose them. Why? It's because He set His covenant love and His loyalty and His covenant compassion on them single-handedly. Let's go back and remind ourselves, back in Exodus chapter 19, I'm going back a lot to the Pentateuch because I think the Pentateuch it's just obvious and clear that it was the basis for their case against Israel. Exodus 19, and this is tender. This is a tender moment. I call this in my OT1 class. This is the marriage ceremony. Mount Sinai is the context in Exodus 19 and 20. Mount Sinai is when the Lord comes down on the mountain and He introduces Himself to His bride by name, and then He begins to define for Israel, this is who you are to be as my bride, as my nation. And in this very tender language, we see in chapter 19, verse 3, actually verse 4. Notice the salvation language that we hear. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. That's the Lord saved His people. Now then, if you'll indeed obey my voice, keep my covenant, then you shall be my segulah, my prized possession. That's what the word is. Among all the peoples, for all of the earth is mine. But who are you, Israel? You're my most prized possession. In other words, ancient kings, they'd have a kind of a warehouse, a Home Depot full of stuff that's valuable, things that they received as gifts, spoils of war. It's all warehoused, and if you can picture this huge warehouse full of stuff, and we're invited on a tour. John pays the $15 a head. We're all taking this guided tour through the king's warehouse of treasure, his treasury, and we're going through and. We're looking at all these things made of gold and expensive, metals and all of these things. And then Jared, you ask the question, "O King, what's the most valuable thing in this treasury? Of all of the things in this warehouse, what's the most valuable thing to you?" And the king says, "Well, I'm glad you asked." So he takes the whole group and we're all ushered back to the very back of the warehouse, third shelf on the left. Goes in and he pulls out a box, opens the box, and there's this little trinket, and he calls it his segulah. This is the most prized possession out of everything that I have, and it's this. And then he says, "And that's who you are, Israel. You are my segulah." This is what the Lord says right here in Exodus 19. It's what a couple declares to one another through their wedding vows, a wedding day. How many of you got married? You're married. There was that special time before publicly you declare who your bride is and what your bride means to you. It's probably very intimate language, right? It's no different here. So the Lord is establishing that intimacy with his people. And that's what we have echoes. So there's this appeal. Now Amos is appealing to that here in chapter 3. And we've looked at that in verse 2. So on that basis, because it's a family affair, because it's between, in a way, husband and wife, it's a family situation, Israel might conclude and may cry out in protest with something like this. God, if God loves us that much, then why would he do this? Why, Amos, are you threatening, are you putting words into the Lord's mouth? I mean, you're talking about exile. You're talking about the nation coming down from the north and the, soon-to-be Assyrians. Would God punish us? Notice what he does here. And this is kind of beginning in verse 3. There's a whole series of what's called a rhetorical question. If you don't know, a rhetorical question is a question asked that has an obvious right answer. And in every single case, what's the answer? Verse 3, do two men walk together unless they have made an appointment? No. Does a lion roar in the forest when it has no prey? No. Does a young lion growl from his den unless he's captured something? No. Does a bird fall into a trap in the ground when there's no bait in it? No. Does a trap spring up from the earth when it captures nothing at all? No. Is a trumpet blown in a city? Will not all the people tremble? Obvious right answer, right? Well, the question is, Amos, are you telling us that God is obligated, covenantally obligated to respond to our rebellion and bring judgment and punishment? See, the obvious answer is in line with these rhetorical questions. Absolutely. He's covenantally obligated. Now, the word punish idea there might seem a little harsh, the idea of punishment. I think the fullness of that word in verse 2b there, the word really translates to like the idea of visit. In other words, we're going to have a little talk here. The idea of visiting his nation. In other words, his presence will be made known, and he'll enact what's called tough love, this idea of tough love. We'll see it again when the prophets, we look at Jeremiah chapter 5, verses 6 through 9 and verse 29. God will visit his good fathers. Here's the idea. Good fathers technically visit their children at times of great disobedience and rebellion. How's that? So we're going to see the heart of a compassionate and caring Father visit the sins and the rebellion of his children through the prophetic message. So that's important to know. And this is kind of a mystery. There's a little bit of mystery here. What we have to recognize is that who is God, right? We saw a little bit of that. We've been seeing who is God. He's a merciful God. He's a gracious God. He's also a God of justice, wrath, and love. All of those things combined. So what we start to see in the prophetic message is the fullness of every nook and cranny of who God is coming at the situation and responding to it. So it shouldn't surprise us sometimes if we see a little bit of this tough love, and sometimes it looks really intense, right, with regards to the language that we'll see. This is the same God who we see unveiled in the New Testament. We're not talking about the God of the Old Testament versus the God of the New Testament. We've hopefully already solved that one. Know that we're talking about the fullness of the same God, regardless of what Old or New Testament you're looking at. All right, well, let's take our first break. Moving pretty fast tonight, so let's take a 10-minute break. And if somebody promises when they go over to the cafe to bring me back a complimentary professorial cup of coffee.
What?
You don't even know what that is. It's a special cup of coffee called kaffa. No, I'm just kidding. So who would do that? Jared, would you do that? Bring me back a cup? You just tell them Dr. Smith's Tuesday night class, and